Well, it's been almost 2 weeks since the Tomb Kings were released, an absolute eternity in the gaming world, and it's time to take a look towards the immediate future, what we can expect going forward for Total War Warhammer 2 as we move towards the inevitable return of Norska in May. Thankfully, Creative Assembly has a handy little roadmap to guide our discussion, and although not much of what we can see is actually confirmed, we can most certainly make some good predictions about what awaits us. And that's half the fun of a free content schedule anyway, right? Imagining which powerful legendary lords and sub-factions await our grubby little Cheeto fingers. So for the first piece of news is that on February 14th, Valentine's Day 2018, the 5th iteration of Make War Not Love will be kicking off. Now, if you've never taken part in these events before, lucky you. I can't remember a single time the event went smoothly, but essentially, 3 or 4 Sega games and their player bases compete in a number of rounds over several days, winning battles for their specific game. At the end of each round, a different bunch of free Sega games and discounts will be made available to the public. And at the end of the competition, the community that wins the most rounds will win free DLC for their game. It's supposed to be a fun little annual event, but pretty much always devolves into accusations of the whole thing being rigged, or other shenanigans going on, just rearing their ugly head. Company of Heroes and Dawn of War are usually the Total War community rivals, but I wouldn't be surprised if DAO 3 didn't make it in this year, because as we know, the game was pretty much dead on arrival. But regardless, whichever game winds up according to their bizarre little algorithm winning the entire competition and gets free content, this year, Total War Warhammer 2 will be receiving a multiplayer map pack if we win, which I'm perfectly happy with, especially if CA crafts some pretty interesting ones a la Shogun 2 or Napoleon, with some tactical variety and symmetry all rolled into one. And if those maps get ported over into the single-player campaign, all the better. I heavily encourage CA to do so that we all get something out of it. Now, this is pretty clearly a response to the sizable amount of backlash they received last year, in which they never made it clear that the legendary lord shown on the free download schedule months before Valentine's Day was the exact same content as the gift for winning Make War Not Love. You can probably see why some people might have thought the whole event was a little shady then. Pretty much everyone believed they were separate, and that we were getting 2 new lords, one free LC, one from Make War Not Love, only to find out that CA was so confident in winning that they'd put up a lord on the schedule with no backup plan whatsoever. It made no sense. The whole thing was incredibly confusing and weirdly handled, and if we had lost, if losing was even possible, I have literally no idea how that whole situation could have been handled. Like, would they have just not given us Isabella? Would they have charged us money for her later? Whatever they did, it probably would have made a lot of people very angry, and although I'm not one for faux outrage, I think it would have been justified in that instance. So this year, probably going to be handled differently. We've got a gift here that makes me and plenty of other multiplayer guys happy, but it's not a lord, I assume, so that people don't get quite as upset if we lose, because there are obviously more campaign players and multiplayer players. But again though, I have absolutely no idea what happens if we don't win. Do we just get those maps later down the line as part of the next DLC? Do they never come? Do we have to pay for them? I seriously doubt we're gonna have to pay for a map pack, but I seriously don't know how they're gonna handle it. So you can probably tell I don't like this particular event very much. Maybe they'll end up changing how the whole thing's run this year. I would like them to, because in previous years it has been a bit of a crapshoot, but we'll see on that front. Moving on, we've got what is likely a new legendary lord for the Children of the Old Ones that will presumably launch alongside the first lord pack for Total War Warhammer 2. The temple in the background, of course, is a dead giveaway as a Lizardmen lord, but what it comes alongside is not quite so obvious. So, in Total War Warhammer 1, the first lord pack was obviously the Grim and the Grave DLC, the Empire versus the Vampire Counts, and Vlad von Karstein, Vasha Nesh from Ye Olde Nehekara, was the free lord. When the King and the Warlord came some months later, it was Wurzag who came with the Dwarfs and Greenskins, so in Game 1, the free lords came with the faction packs relating to their race. The problem with that was that it gave some factions 4 lords while leaving the other factions with only 2, especially with that first lord pack. So it will be interesting to see if CA switches it around this time and gives us a Lizardmen free LC lord alongside the High Elf Dark Elf lord pack, and vice versa. I think that's a better way to spread out the content and ensure that every faction is getting some additional love without long droughts in between. So my money is on a Lizardmen lord coming in March alongside the Queen and the Crone DLC, Alariel vs Hellebrand, as the High Elf vs Dark Elf lord pack. Why do I say March? Well, despite Grace saying that she wasn't aware of any new content coming between Tomb Kings and Norska back in December, I have a seriously hard time believing CA will want to go 5 or 6 months with no more paid content or patches. and compared to a race pack like the Tomb Kings, a Lord pack with some new units and start positions simply isn't on the same level of challenge to create or monetary cost overall. I don't know what their timetable or turnaround is for their Lord packs, but I imagine it's quite a bit shorter than full-on race packs, so that would mean Lord pack in March, Thrones of Britannia in April, Norska in May, and I think that's a very logical timetable. But who will the Free Lord actually be? Well, as we've discussed before, 10-1 is the front runner for the Rat and the Serpent DLC, facing off against either Ikit Claw or Greyseer Thankwall. So the Skink Legendary Lord will be a paid DLC. I think most of us can agree on that front. Not guaranteed, but it's very logical. I think it makes the most sense. That leaves two likely choices, and a third that may be wishful thinking, but I think would offer a whole lot to the game in terms of free LC. Now the first two both hail from Itza, the first city, greatest of the surviving temple complexes, and home to some of the most powerful lizardmen in the history of the planet. Gor-Rok, the Great White Lizard, and Venerable Lord Kroak, eldest and wisest of the first generation Slann, without question the strongest wielder of magic in Warhammer, period, at least when he was alive. Now Itza is the most likely candidate for a Lizardmen Lord because it's a 10-slot city, has a gold mine, and a ton of strategic importance in the heartland of Lustria. And Gor-Rok is super cool. The Great White Lizard emerged from a spawning pool in Itza solo and as an albino, which is a combination that makes Skaven and Demons of Chaos poop themselves in fear, because it meant that he was marked for greatness in every sense of the word. Dude is gigantic, especially for a Saurus, like the size of a Kroxagor, and as is expected of any named lizard, has fought and conquered on every continent on the planet. He carries the magical mace of Ulamak and the shield of Eons, forged out of a slab of volcanic rock, and unlike our boy Kroakgar, doesn't rely on a big scary dinosaur to do all his killing for him. No mount for Gor-Rok, he gets into the thick of it and gives him the Cloaca special up close and personal. He's a hero in the tabletop, but I think he's a pretty logical choice to make the jump up to Lord status, and I would be perfectly happy if he did. Awesome model, easy to implement, would be great to watch him be the solid rock upon which the hordes of Dagoraki demons would break and break again. And then there's Lord Kroak, the first and greatest Slann spawned upon the world, taught by the old ones themselves. We've covered some of his lore before in the Lizardmen lore, army, and tactics video, and my god is his lore epic. Itza, overwhelmed by a demonic invasion numbering in the millions, with millions more pouring through rents in reality, he essentially nukes the city with purifying energy over and over while keeping the temple structures intact, banishing countless nightmares to the abyss, and at the climax of the siege is ripped apart by 10 of Khorne's greatest bloodthirsters. But he doesn't care, wills his spirit back to the mortal plane, and Moabs the place one last time, shaking the planet to its very core in a spell that would come to be known as the Deliverance of Itza. Single-handedly stops the demonic invasion in its tracks, and after the battle, Skinks put the shreds of his body back together and mummify him, becoming the first relic priest, with the soul and will of Kroak still inside his torn-out body. He gives Temple Guard Unbreakable, a huge ward save, a golden death mask that makes it difficult for opponents to land their attacks on him, and of course, the Deliverance of Itza spell itself. The only spell he has access to, but he can cast it a crap load, does a ton of damage, just nukes stuff straight into oblivion off the board, especially if it's demonic or undead in influence, and if he's going after you, you're gonna be in for a bad time. I think it's impossible to know which way CA will go on this. Kroak is certainly more iconic than Gor-Rok, but he also has an arguably more limited playstyle as a relatively immobile caster with only one spell. Very powerful spell, mind you, but one spell nonetheless. So I'd argue that Gor-Rok is a bit more likely, but there's no question in my mind that CA could make Kroak fun and interesting to play. Certainly more iconic than Gor-Rok as well, like I said, and being the most important character in Lizardmen history, his inclusion seems very logical. But my vote would actually go to Nakai the Wanderer if I had a choice between the three. He's an albino Kroxagor of the legendary first spawning, who functions kind of like the Green Knight of the Lizardmen, a force of nature who appears when the situation is most dire. He helped Mazda Mundi conquer Albion and establish a new temple city there, and he's appeared in every civilization-defining battle Lizardmen have ever engaged in, from the defense of Itza to the rise of Sotek and war with Clan Pestilence. His inclusion would mean we have a lord for every single Lizardmen race. The Skinks, with 10-1, the Kroxagors with Nakai, the Slann with Mazda Mundi, and the Saurus with Kroakgar, and I don't think he'd be particularly hard to implement, but he would add some unique flavor and a different playstyle to a Lizardmen campaign. Obviously, with a heavy focus on Kroxagors, I imagine he'd be in control of a horde army, rather than owning any particular temple city. An ambushing Lizardmen horde would be very different from what we already have in the game, and although he wasn't in the 8th edition army book, he does have a lot to offer. I think he's a bit of a stretch, and I'd say in order of likelihood it goes Gor-Rok, Kroak very close behind, and then a big gap to Nakai, but he does have a chance for sure, and I do think he would offer a lot. So while those are the Lizardmen choices for the free LC, I'm purposely not talking about other skink characters, because again, I think 10 and 1 will cover the base nicely for skinks in his Lord pack. We will still need to mention the actual Lord pack it would drop alongside. So in March, my bet is High Elves versus Dark Elves, just in time for my birthday, with Alarielle the Everqueen and Crone Hellebron facing off in the Queen and the Crone DLC. I think they are the most likely next paid DLC, in part because of a few leaks and data mining shenanigans, where we got a look at text including the words Shadow Warriors and the Charybdis. And now Shadow Warriors are obviously tied to Alathanar, and honestly, he and Alarielle could easily be switched, but my bet is still on the very powerful ladies facing off, just because it's a teeny bit more thematic, and just makes a little bit more sense to have the two queens going at it. The Blood Queen of Harganeth and the Ever Queen of Ulthuan. I think that is a little bit more thematic than Alathanar versus Hellebron, but still could go either way. Shadow Warriors seem like a very likely free content addition, alongside the same lines as what we had in the Blood Knights for Game 1, while Sisters of Avalorn and the Charybdis headline the paid DLC units. And Shadow Warriors kind of fill the role of Deepwood Scouts for the High Elves. Vanguard, Stalk, 360-degree fire arc, and fire while moving, but they lack armor piercing and the damage of something like Waywatchers from range, but what they trade off from in their range DPS, they gain in melee, where although they are still squishy, they do have very decent melee skill and can defend themselves quite well, even beat lower tier infantry. Which then leaves Alathanar and Malice Darkblade as the free content lords to come later down the line. Two lords I am exceptionally excited for, and I think many of you guys are as well, having read the entirety of the Malice Darkblade Omnibus, one of the most iconic Warhammer characters in history simply because of those novels. Being able to unleash the bound demon Zarkan, Drinker of Worlds, would be incredibly cool, as is the Dark Elf Rambo himself. I mean, he just never stops. No matter how bad he gets hurt, that motor just keeps running off sheer willpower, and Malice could start either with the Scourge of Cain subfaction near the Shadowlands in Ulthuan, or in Haggrafe, the Black Crag south of Nagorond. And of course, there is the Shadow King himself, covered his lore in depth in another video, a brutal and ruthless Azur that probably shares more in common with the Dark Elves than the High Elves, simply because his homeland had to be that way after the Sundering and subsequent invasions of the continent. Would be one of the only range-focused legendary lords we've had in the trilogy so far, with powerful armor-piercing shots, stalk, snipe, and a strong focus on ambushing, sacking, and razing. He would control the Nagarai subfaction in the northwest corner of Ulthuan. And as for the Skaven, I fully believe they'll be the vampire counts of Game 2, with the most start positions and legendary lords to choose from of any of the factions in Game 2, and whether it's Ikit Claw or Thankwall who makes it into the Lord pack versus 10 and 1, I think the other has a very good shot at becoming the second game's White Dwarf, as part of another standalone promotional effort like Gromrindal was in Game 1. Now, people are talking about that slot after Lizardmen Lord being a hint at something in the desert. They're seeing that kind of orange tinge to it and saying, oh yeah, that might be Araby, that might be something in the desert. But to me, that looks more like clouds and more like open sky, and I think it's going to be the free unit, possibly the Shadow Warriors, rather than a Lord or a faction pack. And honestly, I don't expect a free LC race in Total War Warhammer 2 at all. I think CA was building goodwill in Game 1 and trying to hook people into the trilogy, and with that now firmly established in many people's eyes, I'm not sure they're going to want to eat the cost of creating another race from scratch to just give away. I do think Araby is entirely possible, maybe even likely, although if we get them, I do believe they will come after the Dogs of War Southern Realms, which is the most logical next race pack following the Tomb Kings, because they have so much lore and so many units, stuff we will most certainly be covering in videos soon. But yeah, if or when Araby comes, it's not gonna be free content. Fleshing out that race fully will be an expensive endeavor, and I don't think CA will want to give that away for free. Additional things I still expect to come, although perhaps not as part of the schedule itself, are of course the Amethyst Wizard, Lore of Death for the Empire, a change-up of many of the old world start positions, which CA stated they are looking into, so moving lords like Ungrim to Karak Kadrin, Azhag to Troll Country, that sort of stuff, which, to be fair, does have some debate swirling around it, right? Because people are right to point out that adding new star positions does make it much harder to use other cool legendary lords in a single playthrough. But at the same time, it also does add replayability if you decide to play a campaign again, as a new start position with a new color scheme can completely change how events play out. So I see it both ways, but CA has been pretty clear that they like the idea of giving players more start positions to choose from, and that has been the trend going into Game 2. But those are my predictions for everything that we know about coming up relatively soon. As we get more and more information and time marches ever on, I imagine some of what I've said will be proven wrong, but I think it's a logical setup for the free content schedule that will give us a bunch of new toys to play with and keep the hype rolling on into Total War Warhammer 3, where the Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, and Demons of Chaos will finally come out to play. Let me know what you guys think is coming up soon, both in terms of DLC and free content, and let's have a discussion about what we'd like to see and what we actually expect to see, because those aren't always the same thing, of course, when we're going forward here. So, thank you all for watching. Indie Pride, signing out for now.